Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. Mark Green here, talking all things weight loss, fitness and healthy living. Today we are looking at a topic I'm asked about an awful lot, about what is best for weight loss. High intensity interval training or steady state, lower intensity cardiovascular work. Now, this is something that I just wanted to address to clear up some myths and hopefully give you a better understanding about the best approach for you to reach your weight loss goals. So let's go. Now, if we're going to define which one's best, we first need to understand them. So I've got the board here so we can really delve into the different factors that are going to affect whether or not you should be doing either of these for your weight loss goals. So let's start with the continuous side of things, the lower intensity stuff. Now over here, I've written down what's going on whilst your body's doing this continuous steady state, lower intensity exercise. Now you may have heard of this as aerobic exercise. So all aerobic means is with oxygen. So your body is breaking down fats and carbohydrates to be used as energy to help fuel your exercise. Then oxygen that you breathe in combines with those two nutrients to yield energy. Now, as you get more intense with your exercise, you break down more fat and carbohydrate, meaning you need to breathe in more oxygen, which is why your breathing rate starts to increase. Now, we'll talk a bit more about what happens as you get more and more intense. But at the moment, we're living in the aerobic cardiovascular zone. So you might have heard of this actually, it's called cardio. This is what it's more commonly called these days. Now in the middle here, we've got this intensity gauge. So at the top here, you've got max, then you've got 80% max, 70% max, 50% and rest. So when we're in our cardio zone, typically speaking, we're below this 70% line. We're living down here, okay? And actually, you're going to be burning up more fat than carbohydrate. Fat's actually quite a clunky molecule. It takes a while to break down, but the energy yield is really good. So you get more bang for your buck. As you get more intense, you need to rely on more carbohydrates. It's a quicker molecule to break down, so you can get a quicker energy fix. Now, let's look at this then. Now, this 70% line, this is when it's going to tip into higher intensity. But this will vary for different people. So less fit people will tip into higher intensity earlier, and more fit people will tip into higher intensity later on. So for example, Mo Farah, he will not tip into that high intensity zone until he's about 80-90% of his max heart rate. And that's why he's able to sustain cardiovascular work for such a long time, like a marathon, and bash it out in just over 2 hours. Because his cardiovascular system is so well developed that he doesn't tip into that high intensity zone until he's at like really high percentages of his max heart rate. So then what happens when we do tip into this red zone? This is when we go into the interval anaerobic high intensity zone. So you might have heard of anaerobic as well. Now this means without oxygen. So now with that fat and carbohydrate that's being broken down, we start to shift the balance. So now you're starting to rely more on the carbohydrates than the fat, because carbohydrates can be broken down quicker, and you'll start to breathe a lot faster because you are breaking down more carbs and more fat at a more rapid rate. Now, if you keep getting more and more intense, you will tip over a threshold where suddenly the demand for energy outranks or outsupplies the amount of O2 that you can breathe in. So what happens is you start to accumulate acid and hydrogen ions in your muscles, and you'll start getting a real burning effect. You'll start to breathe real heavy. You won't be able to hold a conversation. We've probably all been there. It's not a nice place to be, okay? Now, what you'll find is you'll only be able to sustain this anaerobic intensity for only short periods. And this is why it's the 100-meter sprint, not the 5,000-meter sprint, because you will have to drop off the intensity to enable more oxygen to be breathed in, to combine with fat and protein, wash away those acid products like lactate and hydrogen, and also meet the energy demand that your body's producing. So that's the difference between the two. Now, one thing we need to understand is actually how HIIT is now interpreted, high intensity interval training, because when it was first conceived, actually what we were talking about is max efforts repeatedly. So you would do a max effort for maybe 30 seconds, then take a large chunk of rest and repeat, okay? So really you are only sustaining this max effort for very short durations. And the original research was only looking at whether or not doing this was comparable to gaining fitness, the similar as going out and doing continuous steady state exercise, wasn't looking at weight loss. Now we're going to start to think about the weight loss side of things shortly, so bear with me. But as time's gone by, obviously the research has caught on and it's become more mainstream. So now actually more 80-70% of max is starting to be labeled as high intensity interval training. And don't get me wrong, you do go into some high intensity zones, but if you think about a circuit class, it lasts probably 30 to 45 minutes, maybe an hour at times. And there's going to be periods where that's very uncomfortable, but if you're sustaining a circuit for over 30 seconds, you are not anywhere near that high intensity zone. You're doing a combination of anaerobic and aerobic work just because you cannot sustain that anaerobic zone for very long. So actually what we think of as conventional HIIT is actually probably more like high intensity aerobic work with some anaerobic thrown in for the mix, okay? So suddenly the lines start to become blurred. Then to help further confuse things, we have other variables that we can look at. So this is kind of like things like the time of exercise. So actually we could do an anaerobic session and we could do those maximum efforts as it was in its original conception. Maximum effort for say 30 seconds and do that 4 times, okay? Whereas we could do a continuous steady state run, for example, but do it for 30 minutes. So which one's going to burn the more calories? Obviously it's going to be the steady state. Then we can look at the effort as well. So when we're looking at the effort, we're looking at this graph here. So we could do continuous steady state cardiovascular or aerobic work, but we could be working just under this 70% line here. We could work just above it. So we're working at threshold essentially. So when we start crossing over into this anaerobic zone, there's something called your anaerobic threshold. So that's when you can't get enough oxygen in to deal with the energy demand. But you can just train just below it and actually sustain that for quite a while. Or you could actually just hover around this 50% mark here, or even below it. And then suddenly you've got two different beasts because they're both continuous aerobic work, but one is much more intense than the other. So again, lines getting more blurred. Then we also have these two variables. So we have the calories per minute. So essentially this is how many calories are you burning each minute. So if you're at maximum and you're doing a 30-second all-out effort, then the calories per minute are going to be as high as they can be. So that might be somewhere like 15 to 18 calories per minute, which is a big hit, okay? And then as you come away from that, you're going to burn less calories per minute. But then you also need to think about the total calories. So this ties back in with what I just said. So we could do 30-second bouts 4 times of maximum effort, but your total exercise time is only 2 minutes. So your total calorie burn is actually quite low. Maybe what? 50 calories, maybe a little bit more, despite the fact you're working off a really high calorie per minute burn. Whereas the continuous steady state of 50%, if you did that for half an hour, your total calories are going to be much better, but your calories per minute are going to be a lot less. Then we've also got this other thing called the excessive post-oxygen consumption after exercise, otherwise known as EPOC. So essentially this is how much your metabolism ramps up after exercise, well during exercise, but also remains elevated after exercise. So you find low intensity activities don't really induce this effect. Once you stop, like if you go for a walk, once you stop, your body just settles back quite quickly to normal and you don't really burn many extra calories afterwards. Whereas when you're doing this high intensity stuff, you really raise that metabolism and then it stays elevated for quite some time afterwards. So you're burning calories after the event, after the exercise session. And it's thought that this can add about 15% of total calories burned in the session on top of what you did. Does that make sense? 15% extra calories comparative to what you burned in the session. There it is. So you don't really get this so much in your typical continuous steady state aerobic activity. You do get it with this anaerobic activity. Okay, but of course if you've only done a small amount of work, then even this EPOC event effect is going to be small. So we've got a lot of factors going on, okay? Now one of the other key benefits about high intensity training that we should probably mention is the hormonal effect it has on your body. So when you do high intensity exercise, your body will be put under stress And when your body's stressed, it starts to release hormones such as adrenaline, noradrenaline, and cortisol. And what these hormones do is they get your body to start mobilizing your fat stores. So it helps you burn fat because the body's put under stress. So essentially it puts you into a calorie burning situation. Your body is preparing itself to have to use its energy stores. Just like if you saw a bear in nature or you were being chased by a lion. So we can actually manipulate the type of exercise we do in order to utilize our fat stores. However, this doesn't change the fact that even if you're doing high intensity training, if you're not doing it for very long, you're still not going to have a huge calorie burn overall. So the hormonal effect will still not overcome that. And this also ties into that EPOC effect that we were talking about. So that ramping up of the metabolism is all related to the hormonal response, the energy demand, the oxygen demand. It's all interlinked. But this is just another thing that's happening in the body to help you understand the benefits of high intensity training, which you wouldn't necessarily get with a low intensity steady state. But as we'll go on to talk about, and some of the points we've already made, it depends on where you lay with that steady state training, because if you're running at around 70% maximum, then you're going to have some stress under your body because it's hard to sustain that for a prolonged period. So there's going to get a point when it becomes a bit of a battle. Whereas if you're living down here in the 50% intensity and it's quite easy, then you're not going to be releasing those stress hormones. The last thing I just wanted to separate out is also weight loss from fitness, because we can build fitness but actually still not be inducing much of a weight loss effect. And again, this is that max interval training that we're talking about. So doing maximum effort for 30 seconds 4 times and building up maybe up to 7, which is how it was back in the day when they originally tested this, it builds fitness, no doubt about it. It's comparable to that aerobic work. But in terms of weight loss, the jury's out because you're not burning many calories. As opposed to someone that lives at this 50% max here, you're going to get fitter if you're doing that regularly, but if you're not challenging your body and increasing the activity sometimes, i.e. going over above and beyond what you're comfortable with, you're not really going to improve your fitness so much, but what you are going to do is continue to burn up calories. So someone that does a lot of walking, a lot of hiking, they might sustain quite a slight frame, but they might not necessarily be able to go out and do a running event that's quite long. Now, I just want to show you 2 examples as well that I put to the test just to highlight what I'm talking about here. So I've got 2 runs, so let me just pull up the first picture here. So this is a continuous run I did. I think I set the pace at around 12.5 kilometers an hour, I think. So that's pretty comfortable for me. As you can see, I did 5 kilometers, of which I burned 417 calories, and it took me 23 minutes 14. Average pace was 4 minutes 38. So if there's any mathematicians out there, you could probably reverse engineer it to see exactly what pace I was at. Nonetheless, it was pretty comfortable for me, and I was hovering roughly around that 70% sort of effort, but continuously. It didn't mean I had to drop off the pace. Now let's look at a different run that I did, which was intervals, higher intensity stuff, but various bouts of it. So as you can see, this one was also 5 kilometers, but this time I've burned less calories, 405 calories as opposed to, 417. So it's taken me a little bit longer at 24 minutes, and the average pace was obviously off as well, or a little bit lower because it was 447, which actually ties in again with a longer duration. So what did I do with this one? So I started off, I think the pace at this one was 14.6 kilometers an hour on a 1% incline. I did the first 2 kilometers back to back, then I dropped off for 2 minutes, then I did another 1 kilometer, dropped off for 2 minutes, another 1 kilometer, dropped off for 2 minutes. Can't remember that, can't see if that's 4 or 5 that I did, but basically I intervaled up to 5 kilometers. And actually, when we look at the total calorie burn, we can see that the aerobic activity has actually has actually won the day in terms of calories burned. Now obviously both will have this EPOC effect because the aerobic run that I did wasn't easy, but it was something that I could sustain quite comfortably. But it was definitely, I definitely knew I was exercising as opposed to something that was like a walk. Whereas the anaerobic one, the interval training, that's going to improve my fitness more because I was increasing the overall intensity. So it's allowing my body to buffer that acid, learn how to use these carbohydrates and fat without oxygen. So your body gets better at that. which I wouldn't necessarily achieve just continuously running at this 70% or around that sort of mark. So you need to combine the two for fitness. But in terms of a purely weight loss perspective, actually, the continuous was probably better than the interval training that I did. But of course, I'm a bit of an exception to the rule in terms of how I train, because not everyone's going to be living around that sort of threshold area. Their options might be 50%, or they might actually be doing circuit training where they really push it for a little bit and then rest off. So in those circumstances, the lines actually become a bit more clear. So this is when that calories per minute and total calories burned really factor in. So for me, if you're someone that has the choice between doing an easy sort of jog on the treadmill continuously at say 50% your max heart rate, and that's quite easy and you can sustain it, then you're going to have to do that for an awful long time before you get the necessary calorie burn, because your calories per minute is so low, before you would see those weight loss effects. Whereas if you were able to go and do a HIIT class or a circuit class, you're going to be able to achieve the same weight loss effect in a much shorter time period than what you would have done with that lower intensity. Don't know if anyone can hear that, but there's a dog barking outside. If you can hear it, sorry. Shush. Anyway, so then we can start to see then that actually it's probably better to be doing this high intensity stuff, because really what you're doing is you're not just in this anaerobic zone necessarily, you're just doing high intensity cardio. So you're just working harder, which is good. You just want to, if you can just work harder, then you're going to get a better result. So sometimes I think we can overcomplicate these strategies, and actually essentially what you need to do is go in, push yourself, work roughly off an intensity that feels hard but isn't necessarily killing you, and then you must get a good enough overall calorie burn for the entire session to make sure that it makes a difference. So you need to combine the two. It needs to be total calories and utilizing those calories per minute, getting that EPOC effect. So after you finish your exercise, it still feels like you're hot, you know, you can feel that you've had an exercise session. And ultimately, guys, that kind of hopefully answers the question. And that's it, guys. I hope you found this video useful. If you did, remember to hit the subscribe and like buttons. And just as a closing comment, sometimes I think we can overcomplicate these things. You can hear the dog barking again. Hopefully the mic's not picking it up. Sometimes I think we can overcomplicate these things. And if this does seem a bit overly complicated, the idea is just to help you understand what's happening in your body. Because if you can understand it, you can then adjust and adapt your training to suit you. Now we're going to be bringing more videos just like this, so keep an eye out for that. I think that's enough for today, so we'll leave it there, and I'll see you at the next video.